session with Frédéric Pajak. Frédéric Pajak, I'm sure you've already heard this name. And since he has lived in Lausanne sporadically and still comes back to the region quite regularly, some of you probably even know him very well. By way of reminder, Frédéric is the son of the French painter of Polish origin, Jacques Pajak, whose convulsive and torrential work approaches lyrical abstraction and a form of neo-expressionism. He told me that his grandfather was also a painter, his great-uncle, great-grandmother, and there may be other painters in their family, but it really is a painting dynasty. Frédéric's father died in an automobile accident to the young age of 35, and the accident left a deep mark on his son and gave him a lasting image as a meteor struck by lightning. He was only 10 years old at the time. As a teenager, he was bruised by life. He has always been in revolt, and he's a voracious reader who is offended and hurt by the world. Very early on, he realized he had to take alternative roads, side roads outside of recognized genres and categories. He published and launched a slew of journals and magazines, which were virulent, offbeat, and ephemeral, published books and directed collections such as the graphic essays published by Bûcher-Chastel, paints, draws, and at the age of 45 invented a new genre, the graphic essay. It has nothing to do with a cartoon or an illustrated book. Frédéric's books bring together texts and drawings that neither illustrate nor explain one another. Each of the two languages has its own life inside the book. In counterpoint, out of kilter, standalone, separate, they still have a form of fellowship which is close and at the same time independent. Since the year 2000, Frédéric has been a constant winner of awards and prizes. The Danton Award in 1999 for L'immense solitude, published at the Presse Universitaire de France. Then the Goncourt Prize for biography in 2019 for his lives of Emily Dickinson and Marina, Tsetaeva, in the 7th volume of the Uncertain Manifesto, published by Noir sur Blanc. And then there was the Prix du Rayonnement of the Vaudoise Foundation for Culture in 2012, the Médicis Prize for Essays in 2014, a Swiss Literary Prize in 2015, and the Swiss Grand Prize for Literature for his life work in 2020. It is mainly through his breathtaking collection of literary mosaics, graphical mosaics found in the Uncertain Manifesto, that we will be talking today. It's 9 volumes, 3,000 pages, and 2,000 drawings. And it took up 10 years of his life, 10 years, as you say yourself, Frédéric, of daydreaming and fermentation. It took you those 10 years to sketch out a sort of landscape of a familiar and secret feeling, uncertainty. At the end of this long cycle of conversations with your heroes, who are, as you say yourself, magnificent failures, but also through this period of your life, you decided to end this cycle. You say, my book has finally come to an end. It's finally closed. Although you said at the outset that it would be a book without end. Frédéric, to start with, I'd like to ask you about the title of this vast project, Le Manifeste incertain, the Uncertain Manifesto. It's a strange oxymoron, isn't it? Normally, a manifesto is a strong statement, a solemn statement, the affirmation of a program. It's like a signboard held up for all to see. But you use the adjective uncertain. Doubt springs up immediately, fuzzy, hazy, hesitant, precarious. Tell us why you chose such an unusual title. Well, it wasn't the title of a book to start with. It was a title of something that didn't exist. I was about 18 years old at the time, I worked for the French railways, in the night trains, in the sleeping cars, and every 3 days I would go from Geneva to Rome and back. These were the years of lead, or so they were called in Italy, years when there was an upwelling of fascism and Trotskyism and Maoism as well. Some of the Maoists went into the Brigade Rouge, the Red Brigades, with very strong and violent ideologies. My contemporaries were often leftists rather than fascists, but they were very steeped in some ideology, Trotskyist or Maoist ideology, and those who escaped these ideologies were rare. And I was definitely against both of these ideologies. I already had an idea of what was going on in China, and so there's no way I could agree with the Maoists. And for me, Trotsky was the one who had assassinated the anarchists at Kronstadt, so he was more of an assassin to me than a figure to be followed. So in reaction to these ideologies, the term uncertain manifesto came to mind one night when I was working in the train. I liked to chat with people who came to have a drink at the bar. They'd come and have a drink and smoke, and we'd chat. Italians going home to Rome. And during one of these discussions, the term uncertain manifesto just appeared. I never knew it would one day become a book title. I knew it was a title, the title of something. So that was when you were 18, and you started writing it when you were 58? So you incubated it for a long time. Yeah, well, I needed to think about it. The manifest, and these are your words, is anarchistic and unorthodox. Anarchistic, yes, but you seem to have a pretty benevolent view of the Swiss political system. Are you saying that unorthodoxy, that right thinking or conventional thinking is intellectual laziness? Well, what I really like in Switzerland, that's why I defend the political system, is the presidential election, the presidential mode. There's no election. I'm French and Swiss, and I often think that if we took the best aspects of Switzerland and took them to France and vice versa, it would make two very nice countries, two very good countries. With the Swiss Federal Council and the rotating system for the presidency. In France, it's an idiotic system. The presidential system permeates everything. The campaign is always about to happening. We're obsessed with it, and everybody knows it's absurd. But in France, nobody wants to talk about reforming the system. And nobody wants to take inspiration from the Swiss system, which I'm not saying it's perfect. It is still definitely superior to the French system. What was the question? Unorthodoxy. I don't know if I'm unorthodox. I don't know if I'm an improper thinker. Am I against society? Well, I disagree with many dominant ideologies, that's for sure. Some of them come from conventional movements or streams, by which I mean a certain orthodoxy and a lot of rules and a lot of things that are prohibited. Both of us were alive in the 1970s, and we were already adults. And what I remember is there was a huge degree of freedom. And censorship is rising, and it's couched in politically correct terms of politically correct thinking. Look at the yellow vests and the CRS. And look at all the things that are outlawed. Marijuana. What's the difference between marijuana and strong spirits? It's ridiculous. I mean, that's just one small example. I could give you many more. As I said, you began your vast undertaking when you were 58 years old. How did you approach it then, and how would you define it now? Was it a long journey? Geographical, political, biographical, literary, autobiographical, literary, and artistic journey? Is it a form of total art, or Gesamtkunst, as we would say in German? I didn't know what direction the book was going in when I started. I wanted to write a book with no end. How could I put this? I wanted to merge my life with a book. I wanted my life to become a book, and a book that would have no ending. I didn't have a plan. I didn't even have any authors that I was especially interested in writing about. So I know that I was starting off on an adventure. It's a bit like going on a trip to a country without taking a map. Well, then, why are you now closing the book? I don't really have a reason. I decided there would be 9 volumes to the Manifesto, but it doesn't make any sense. It could have been 10 or 15. I have no idea why. It turns out to be 9 volumes. I don't know. Maybe the number is symbolic. When I think back over the 10 years I've spent living with this book as it developed, I realized that I was living inside it. I was immersed in it. I breathed, slept, and ate this book, and it is indeed a journey to other continents, to countries I hadn't visited, Russia. All of these journeys were extraordinary. I didn't go as a tourist. I went to think and write and draw. I wasn't there as a consumer of culture, as it were. No, I was there to work. I don't really like that word, work, but I was there with a purpose. And actually, what I was doing is work. It doesn't seem like work to me. It's my life. The book is my life. It's been my life. And there will be other books after this that will be part of my life, too. With these books, if I understand, you're going to continue in another vein, but you invented a genre that didn't exist before. Where did that spring from? When did you decide that you needed to write and draw for one and the same book? If you think, as you've said, that text and drawings are antagonistic. Well, I've always drawn and written, but I never really wanted to be a professional artist. I didn't want to be a professional writer. I didn't want to have a label and a profession. But what I understood early on in my life, maybe even in my childhood, was that I existed to write a book. Not novels. I didn't want to write novels or be a biographer or be a graphic artist or draw cartoons. It wasn't that. It wasn't that interested me. It was putting a book together from start to finish, because I do the layout of my books as well. It's like editing a film. Sometimes I try 10 different layouts before I find the right one. So it's really a construction project, in a way. And I try to put everything I know how to do, or everything I think I know how to do, in the book. Drawings, yes, but the drawings are very different from each other. I don't want them to be illustrations. They aren't illustrations. Each one of them is a challenge for me. I'm a lyrical artist, like my father was. I'm an expressionist, so I strive to achieve a form of drawing in black and white for the book. I don't draw what I draw because these are things I like. These are images that I like. What I want to do is put the book together. It's not that I love to draw, or I love to write, or I love to read. It's the truth. It's the truth. When I draw, it's a task. It's very hard going. It's laborious. I don't draw with great gusto and pleasure. If I wanted to have fun, I'd probably draw monsters or something else. But I'm not saying that there's no satisfaction that comes from it, but it's pretty rare. Well, what do you express in the drawings that writing is not sufficient for, that writing doesn't afford? I often say that the heroes of my books are feelings in uncertainty, solitude, melancholia, sadness after a failed relationship. The Uncertain Manifesto is really based on the feeling of uncertainty. That is the hero of the book. When I draw, I'm adding a non-intellectual dimension, an unconscious dimension. Because I don't do a pencil, I don't sketch before. I go straight in with my ink pen. So even if some of the drawings are realistic or semi-realistic and show cities or depict people, I try to maintain a certain degree of spontaneity without making it into a proper lyrical drawing. Insofar as possible, I want the drawings to be precise. You told me that drawing, well, I imagine that you write all the time, whereas you told me that you save about 2 months a year to dive deeply into your drawing, and that it was a bit painful. Why do you force yourself to do that? Is writing a liberation and drawing is a torment? Well, firstly, before I can draw or write, I have to read. If I'm writing about Van Gogh, I have to read many, many different sources. His correspondence, I read his correspondence with Theo several times. But I also read biographies, which are mainly in the main, pretty mediocre. Or let's say, now I'm working on a poet called Germain Nouveau. There's not a lot of information on him, and a lot of them are about mysticism. And his fellow mystics wrote these books, and there's the books are not very good, but there's no other information about him. Sometimes you have to take what you can get. The biographies on Van Gogh, for example, are very much focused on his mental illness, on his personality that was beyond all boundaries. He was mentally ill, but only for short periods of his life. When he had his episode with Gauguin, it only lasted a few months, a year at the most. And then he recovered. We don't really know whether he committed suicide. I think it's it's up for debate. If he really wanted to commit suicide, wouldn't he have shot himself in the heart instead of in the stomach? Or wouldn't he have shot himself twice if he missed the first time? There was never an investigation. They didn't study the bullet and the ballistics. The whole thing was a mess from start to finish. Van Gogh's death remains highly debatable. So why would I put myself through it, especially for the drawing? Well, I put myself through it because I'm deep into the book. I am at this book's slave. The book is my master. The book tells me what I have to do. It's not really something I control. It's not within my control. It's not within my power to control it. Reading can be tedious, 10 or 15,000 pages to read, take notes, get the notes together, tidy them up, compare the different books about an author. Walter Benjamin, for example, he's a difficult author. He's obscure, difficult to understand, a lot of Marxist jargon that has disappeared, so you have to go back and delve deeply into the 1930s and study the dialectic that prevailed up until the 1970s, but nobody talks about this dialectic anymore. So Walter Benjamin's work is a bit outdated because this Marxist terminology is no longer used. So if you want to talk about Benjamin and his destiny, you have to read all of these books. The biographies on Benjamin are pretty disastrous, I have to say. But I have to read them. So I put myself through that. And I'm not really an avid reader. I know that might sound strange, but I was a late reader. You said you're a voracious reader. Yes, I'm a voracious reader, but not because I like it. It's because I need to get as much information as I can about the author or the character. I might read authors who are not of any interest to me. For example, when I wrote about Gobineau, was, for me, I mean, all I knew about were the public stereotypes. But when I read his 1,000-page book on human inequality, a very interesting book, it's not racist. The title is misunderstood. Anyway, that was very tedious, but you have to read all of Gobineau if you want to understand what he was getting at. People are very comforted by their prejudices and their biases. People often say, oh, he was a Nazi, etc. Even people who have read my book or say they've read my book, they can't manage to say Gobineau was not a Nazi. He was anything but a racist. In fact, very few have even read Gobineau. There are 3 volumes published in the Pléiade edition in France, and nobody buys them. They're not even available in bookshops anymore. You have to order them. To sum up, I may miss some, but Benjamin, Nietzsche, Pavese, Joyce, Van Gogh, Emily Dickinson, Olga Tsetaeva, Ezra Pound, Pessoa. Your characters are dark heroes. They're tragic. They're often desperate. They're often misunderstood or reduced to a few cliches, this is what you were saying about Van Gogh, and have gone towards their destiny as if it were a series of stations of the cross. Apart from Van Gogh, who you read an entire book about, and to a lesser extent the Chinese painter Ma Desheng, who you talk about in Manifesto number 8, if I'm not mistaken, there are few references to the visual arts in your books, and at least I didn't find any traces at all of the graphic artists and engravers who you're so fond of and who we see in the exhibitions that you curate. Why is this? Well, there's Bram van Velde, there's Giacometti, I didn't put him in, and others as well. They could have been characters in the Uncertain Manifesto. I like Giacometti a lot, and I have a lot to say about him. I'm sure you do. But I don't know. All of these characters, these authors choose me. For example, I wanted to go to Portugal to push back against a prejudice stereotype that I had about Portugal, because I worked in Portugal at one time, and I didn't really like the country. So it was my own prejudice that I had to fight against. I worked there for a few weeks, and I didn't really like it. So I thought that I should go back and try to discover why I didn't like the country. And I went back, and I liked Portugal a lot. Not only did I like the country, but it made me think of Pessoa, who I'd read when I was young. I didn't get to read all of him because not a lot of his works had been translated. I started reading him in the 1970s, and I said to myself, well, he's been translated in the intervening period. All of his poetry has now been translated. There are a couple of books that I didn't even know existed when I was young. I knew about his heteronyms. I knew about the Pessoa system, if you want to call it that, and the larger-than-life personality. So since I was in Lisbon, which I liked as a graphic artist might see it, the earth and the sky that meet, you would almost think that the sky is sitting on the ground. The cobblestone streets, when you look at the cobblestone street and then you look up at the sky, it's absolutely amazing in terms of graphics. And a book came out of that. It's the last volume of the Manifesto, and it retraces Pessoa's destiny, his life, and I read many books about him, articles, psychoanalytic articles, very interesting, in fact. I think that reducing his use of heteronyms to a sort of psychoanalytic phenomenon is not very convincing. But I still quoted one of the psychoanalysts in my book. These characters are very different. But don't you think that all of them carry a part of you? You retrace their lives, you intertwine their lives with yours. You told me that late in the day you discovered that Nietzsche and Pavese had both lost their fathers, as you had. Yes, that's when I decided to write L'immense solitude. My father died when I was very young, and what interested me was finding out how they expressed their sorrow or their pain in their work, or how maybe they didn't express it, and what was the role of literature and confession for them. But what makes me tick is not identifying with authors. I don't identify with them. They feel like strangers to me, and the more like strangers they are to me, the more I find them interesting. For example, Pessoa or Nietzsche, who were loners, without families, no wife. That's something else we have in common. Van Gogh as well. Well, Van Gogh lived with a prostitute, but when he was in Arles, he didn't have a woman. So I don't identify with these figures because doesn't relate to my life. Maybe it's my childhood self who's interested in these destinies. I didn't like my childhood. I didn't like my teenage years. I had a painful adolescence. And the pain that these writers feel. Nietzsche was suicidal at times, very lonely, unhappy. He was an unhappy man. So was Pessoa. He was unable to love, unable to have a satisfying social life. And I was a bit like that when I was a teenager. But it's not. It's not that I identify with them. I don't think I'm like that now. There are two things that are problematic in biography: identifying with the character or writing a hagiography. I try to avoid both those pitfalls, and I hope that in my books there's a form of irony and distance, because if not, if there wasn't, I wouldn't be able to take any interest in anyone, including myself, or feel any kinship with anyone. So I think it's important to keep everything in perspective. In the 9th and last volume of the Manifesto, we see a very unexpected figure. That's the way I saw it. Jesus. You depict Jesus as an eternal wanderer who keeps asking his father to put an end to his life, but his father hasn't been listening for a long time, and Jesus is, please remain unanswered. It's as if you say one could think that God is dead and well and truly dead. Could you comment on that?
In actual fact, I've wanted to write a book about Jesus for a long time, especially about his relationship to his real father. Well, his real father, sort of. I mean, Joseph, his relationship to his mother, his relationship to his brothers, his relationship was not a very good one. There's this point where he enters Capernaum, and he preaches in front of his disciples. He tells them to forsake their families, leave their parents, their siblings, to join him entirely. It's a very violent attack against family, and that fascinates me in Jesus. That's something I find fascinating, and I would like to write a book about this. I haven't done so. Maybe I'll do so one day, but I've taken notes. I'd been to Épinal. There's a story about the Jewish wanderer who is sentenced by Jesus to wander till the end of times. And I was wondering whether his father, God, hadn't sentenced him to wander till the end of times. He resurrected him. We say that he's still amongst us. Is he? Is he still amongst us? Is he still there as a wandering being? So I wanted to hint to this character, the character of a Jewish wanderer. It was also a way of ending the manifesto with a question. The main character of the 9th volume is nonetheless Pessoa. Pessoa, the strange author with 80 heteronyms or so. He invented identities and biographies for a lot of them. He invented entire lives to these heteronyms, and that allowed him to be many others, to quote Rimbaud. Pessoa and you share the same initials, FP. And you say that your own past appears to you as being a series of heteronyms. Is this why the 9th volume necessarily had to be devoted to Pessoa? He was the one who had to finish the manifesto? Well, I'd say it's the contrary. It's when writing about Pessoa that I looked back on my life and realized that we're different people. The reactions you have when you're 20 faced with a given reaction is not the same as the reaction you have when you're 60. You get the feeling that you're two different beings, you're two different people. The issue of heteronyms, the fact that you create another character for yourself, is something that I did as a child. I wrote with a pen name. I'd imagined a whole character. It's fairly common. It happens with a lot of people. The only difference is that it doesn't endure. What I mean to say is that it happened afterwards. Pessoa is the one who made me think back to my life. I wasn't the one thinking about Pessoa. Now, to come back to drawing, you traveled the world over to step in the shoes of your characters who've accompanied you all along the road. It goes well beyond the simple desire to set the scenes. Why are locations so important? The places they've lived, the places they've erred, the places they've wandered, the places where they've been in exile. Well, if I take the example of Nietzsche, I think I've been everywhere he's been, even on the front line in Metz. Does this help you understand the character if you go everywhere they've been? It's absolutely necessary. It's necessary to breathe the air they've breathed. It's impossible to understand Nietzsche if you don't understand what he was looking for in Rapallo. He had suicidal thoughts. You need to go at the exact same season in the middle of winter. And there you can imagine how Nietzsche, who wrote Zarathustra right at that point, is in a state of despair, why he spends sleepless nights. I spent quite a long time in Rapallo, right next to the hotel that he stayed at. It no longer exists, but he could hear fishers singing as they came back. He was allergic to Italy, but in actual fact, when I wrote about him, these were things that I'd felt deeply in my body. I wanted to be as close to him as possible, to be able to translate what he felt through my drawings and through my texts and through what I quote. Part of my writing, which is extremely important, is what I quote. I'm very careful in the way I quote. Quoting is an art. It's a complicated art. I'm not saying I succeed, but what I try doing is quoting as well as possible, as briefly as possible. When I spoke about Nietzsche and Rapallo, I went back to his correspondence, to testimonies, to be as close as possible to this character, to be as close as possible to this human being. To come back to your drawings, when you draw almost as a filmmaker. Your gaze is constantly moving, they're traveling, low-angle shots, high-angle shots, you pan out, you zoom in. Your eye moves all the time when your hand weaves patiently these strokes and cross strokes, the hatching and cross-hatching, as we say in etching. There's almost a difference in tempo between your eye and your hand, isn't there? Well, once again, I chose something that's very similar to etching, to engraving, because my art is a poor art. I can draw anywhere I want, in my workshop, outside. I like to draw when I'm outside in the forest, in the mountain, in a clearing, in a zoo. In botanical gardens. And the first thing that you need to do when you are drawing, and unfortunately very few people think about it, you need to think about the frame. To you it's filmmaking, but to me the master is really Pissarro. He's the one who thought about the frame in painting, and unfortunately Pissarro is underestimated because he's poorly understood, yet he's the one who brought framing to painting in an exceptional way. Once you have the frame to your drawing, once you know how you are going to compose it, you've done most of the work. The rest is easy, but that's the most important. When I draw, what I try doing is, I don't remember what Manifesto it was in, I think it was about Emily Dickinson. I didn't know how to draw Emily Dickinson in her room. I drew her room. What could I say about Emily Dickinson through my drawing? And I thought, well, she had a garden, there were bees. And I said to myself, well, I've never drawn a bee. It's hard to do it in black and white. I tried to draw bees in a beehive. I tried to draw the queen and all the other bees around. I tried to get closer to draw a bee in a flower. If you draw in color, you draw a black stripe, a yellow stripe, and that's it. You've got a bee. In black and white, it's a lot more complicated. And if you get close to a bee, they look like monsters. They're full of hairs. They're pretty gross when you think of it. I'd never drawn a bee in my life, and I started drawing bees the way Heider draws flies. Heider and I have a similar approach. He learned flies by heart. He can draw flies very easily. So I drew bees, skies. In each book, I try to approach the sky in a different way. It's very hard to draw a sky. When you paint, it's much easier than when you draw. You can't. There are no strokes in nature. A cloud is a movement. When drawing is the contrary, is contrary to movement. It's like waves and the sea. You need to solve this problem one way or another. There are all sorts of ways you can cheat when you're drawing. But to me, black and white drawing, or rather black, gray, white drawing, because there are all sorts of hues of gray in my drawings. It's poor art, because with minimum means, you can draw a lot of things. When I discovered the city of Torino, I discovered a city with lots of cars, with lots of hoardings, lights. It's a very modern city. But drawing it is as if I were taking the city's clothes off. I take the cars away to draw the city as it was in Nietzsche's time. I don't know whether we still have a little bit of time to speak about the exhibition you inaugurated a few days ago at the Yeniche Museum in Vevey. It's an exhibition that I recommend to everybody. It's absolutely beautiful. It's an exhibition of portraits and self-portraits, more than 200 faces, from Rembrandt to Kiki Smith, Louis Souta to Andy Warhol to Fayum, Mix et Remix. You're a writer, and you write in the catalog that a face is like an open book. Do you want to explain this? Well, a face, yes, a face is an open book. It's a failure. If I look at Beckett and Giacometti, if you look at Audelaire's self-portraits, it's as if he failed drawing himself, painting himself, and yet it's an open book because the gaze is very tale-telling. Portrait, self-portrait can be with closed eyes. It can be a profile. People can look down. They don't necessarily look straight at you. A portrait doesn't necessarily have to be a face, but there's everything in a face. It's like a landscape. I'm not saying that it says everything, but some artists, Carl Baudelaire, amongst others, who's part of this exhibition, works a little bit like Giacometti. It's as if he was digging grooves, rivers, mountains, hills, cliffs. And all of this creates a face. Everybody's tried a portrait. As a child, we've all drawn our family, relatives, friends. Everybody's tried representing human beings. It's really the first language, first meaningful language that we speak. I observe the people who come and visit the exhibition. They come in as if it were a hot bath. They feel at home. They've already tried drawing portraits. They might have forgotten, but it's still there. There's still a trace. Between self-portrait and autobiography, what are the links? What are the differences? You say portraits are always a punch in the face. Yes, portraits when they're painted or when they're drawn. It's not the same with writing. I wrote a book called Self-Portrait, Autoportrait. I said self-portrait is impossible in writing. Yet, that's what you do with your autobiography, the autobiographies which you intertwine with the biographies of your characters. Well, to speak like Beckett, writing fails. Mix and Remix has 2 dots, 2 lines, and that's his self-portrait. It's a quintessential portrait. He expresses something. He manages to express something with a faint smile, these two dots that represent a gaze. He represents what I call a soul. And I think in drawings, there's always part of a soul. And that's not what I see in autobiographies. Autobiographies convey other feelings, strong feelings sometimes, but it's quite different than with a drawing or with a painting. To come back to what you say writing and drawing is your contribution to realizing that we need to change the world. Is that the ultimate goal of art? You attempt to change the world while knowing that that won't be enough, knowing very well that this is bound to fail, and this is why you're so fascinated by Van Gogh or Giacometti, because they etch or they paint the impossibility of drawing, of painting, of sculpting. It's the beauty in a desperate attempt. That's a good question, and I can't say whether Van Gogh and Giacometti fascinate me or not. I'm not sure it's the right word. They seem strange, and they're strangers to me. After that, I realized that a lot of these people, a lot of these characters have one thing in common, and that is that they failed in their lives. He was considered a loser by his family, by tradesmen. He thought he was a failure. He wrote horrific things about himself. Same thing for Bessot, for Emily Dickinson. They all believed in their work. Van Gogh knew how important he would be in the history of art. He was very learned. He was very intelligent. He knew exactly where he was going, what he was doing. And that's something that we shouldn't forget when we think about him. Same thing with Emily Dickinson. She knew that her poetry would find its place in the history of poetry. Marina, Tsetaeva, same thing. She was very proud in the positive sense of the word. She knew what her contribution was to language and what her contribution was to prose. All these people were misunderstood during their lives, almost entirely misunderstood during their lives. And then, a few years after their passing, sometimes immediately afterwards, in the case of Kafka, for instance, they wanted to destroy their work while believing in it. Goes to show that all these people, all human beings, are paradoxes. Kafka thought his work was most precious than anything else, and yet he asked Max Brod to destroy everything. Emily Dickinson asked her sister to destroy everything. Marina Tsetaeva was sometimes desperate. Van Gogh is the most successful loser in the history of art. Everybody can recognize his work, everybody recognizes his name, and that's something of a miracle. It's quite miraculous. Emily Dickinson's sister refuses to destroy her art and circulated her poetry, which is quite extraordinary. Same thing with Walter Benjamin. I wouldn't say I'm fascinated by this. I would say that I'm happy to have been able to read them. I think we're extremely fortunate to be able to see Van Gogh's paintings, and especially his drawings, because they're even better. I'm more interested in chance. Everything is down to chance. Chance is very important in life. If we look back at our lives, if we look at the role chance played in our lives, we say to ourselves, oh, I should never have been there. I should never have met such and such a person. I should never have done this or that. And at the same time, we were fortunate enough to follow chance, to trust chance. Thank you. Thank you very much, Frédéric. I think it's time to turn to the audience. I don't know whether anyone has a question to put to our guest. If so, there's a roving microphone. I will maybe start with the questions we received via WhatsApp. Good afternoon. Question to Mr. Pajak. You chose realistic rather than expressionist drawings. Is that down to the fact that you want to tell a story through your drawings the way you do so through your texts in a different way? Yes, it's a little bit what I tried to explain. Drawings have no limit. You don't caricature yourself when you start drawing in an expressionist way. It's a little different. Drawing realistically, what does that even mean? You know, I like what Degas said. Towards the end of his life, he said that if I'd seen things better, I would have painted in black and white. Some people say, your drawings are dark, they're black. I say, no, they're not dark. I'm not interested in black. I'm interested in light in my drawings. There's no drawing without light. Black is there to highlight light. And there's a whole array of hues of gray, which are also extremely important. Expressionism is more limited in what it expresses than realism. When you try to draw realistically, you try to escape from reality. You try to create a reality which is different. Drawing in gray, black, and white is not very natural. It's artificial. You're trying to draw in gray, black, and white something that's in color. I could never have drawn the streets of Torino the way I see them. They're melancholy, they're baroque, they're sad, they're slightly arrogant. I could never have drawn them in an expressionist way. What I try to do is convey feelings, and I would have never been able to do so otherwise. This was the only question we received through WhatsApp. Is there a question from the audience? No? If not, then I've got a follow-up question. I was wondering whether you could agree with what André Breton said to Giacometti. André Breton, who was the king of surrealism, and he was appalled by the fact that Giacometti came back to figurative art. He said, well, a face, everybody who knows what a face is. Giacometti answered, well, I don't know. I would tend to agree with him. He was right in doing away with surrealism. There was a style in what he did. He had forsaken his quest before doing surrealist drawings. He tried drawing faces, drawing mountains. he failed, and that's why he moved on. But it's quite extraordinary to see that towards the end of his life, he came back to figurative art. He came back to it, and saying he was incapable of drawing ahead. There's nothing regrettable about it. I hate Picasso. I hate what he said when he said, "I don't research, I find." Giacometti did the exact same thing, the exact opposite. And I can relate to this. As a curator, I look for things, I research, I can't find anything, but it's still the same kind of work. And I can totally relate to what he said. Thank you.
Merci à toi.